"You're not sick," Dr. Preston Vale laughed, his voice echoing off the sterile walls like mockery wrapped in charm. He glanced at his watch, not at me, and scribbled something quick on his tablet. "Anxiety, maybe. You just need rest." My chest burned with a pain that wasn't imaginary. "But I can't breathe sometimes," I whispered. He smiled. "Too white, too rehearsed." "Then breathe slower, Nadia." His words slammed through the fog of fluorescent light. I sat there in my paper gown, heart thudding, as the printer spat out a single sheet labeled "Follow-up, Unnecessary." When I reached for it, he was already holding the door open, waving in the next patient, that laugh sharp, careless, lodged deep in my ribs. I walked out into the evening, wind slapping cold across my face, and for the first time, I wondered if maybe my pain wasn't just physical. Maybe it was something I wasn't meant to notice yet. The drive home blurred into streaks of red taillights and gas station glow. Evan called twice, his voice tired, asking if it went okay. "He says I'm fine," I said, swallowing the metallic taste of the lie. "Good," he sighed, relief coating his words too easily. I tried to mirror it. At home, the world smelled like detergent and distant cooking, ordinary and cruelly normal. But halfway up the stairs, my breath caught sharp again. I gripped the railing as black dots danced across my vision. When I woke, I was on the floor, phone buzzing in my hand. A message blinked from an urgent care nurse I'd seen last month. "Your chart looks odd. Are you sure those labs were done?" My pulse roared. I logged into the patient portal, scrolling past endless jargon. My lab date was changed, my symptoms were rewritten as improvement noted, and the doctor's signature sat neatly on top of everything, clean as bleach. I stared until the screen dimmed, the laugh still echoing somewhere behind my ribs. The next morning, sunlight felt too bright, like it knew something I didn't. I printed the pages anyway, each one humming through the old desk printer in our living room. Evan came in, shirt half tucked, eyes half focused on his phone. "You're still on this?" he muttered. "Maybe just rest, okay?" I looked at him, really looked, and wondered if maybe everyone preferred me quiet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I scrolled back through every visit, every date, every copay. The system said I'd canceled 2 appointments I never missed. I called the office. The receptionist laughed too, but softer, nervous. "Oh, that's strange," she said. "Maybe a technical error." I hung up before the lie finished forming. The bruise under my ribs darkened by morning, a spreading stain of proof. I touched it and remembered my mother's voice years ago, telling me that silence helps no one. She'd said it over a chipped teacup while wrapping my scraped knee in gauze, the smell of iodine and comfort blending together. Back then, I believed adults fixed things. Now I understood some adults just fixed paperwork. I opened my laptop again and stared at the falsified chart, at the neatly signed lie stamped with my name. Something in me hardened, slow but final. I whispered to the empty room, "I have to know the truth." The following week dragged like a fever dream, each hour thick with doubt. The pain in my ribs pulsed whenever I breathed too deep, a dull rhythm reminding me I wasn't crazy. But Dr. Vale's words clung to everything: my breakfast, my shower, the empty seat beside me when Evan left early. I kept replaying that laugh, trying to decide if it was arrogance or certainty. My inbox filled with automated reminders from the clinic, cheerful in tone, robotic in purpose. One message read, "Your follow-up appointment is complete." I hadn't stepped foot there since the day he laughed. Another read, "Medication renewal approved." I'd never filled any prescription. My name, my record, my health, it all seemed borrowed, altered, stolen. One night, I sat on the living room floor surrounded by printouts. The printer coughed out another page, ink smearing at the edges. Each document carried a quiet insult, each line a lie dressed as care. I circled words that felt wrong: resolved, compliance, stable. None of them belonged to me. I remembered the billing clerk's offhand comment when I'd checked out weeks earlier, something about high acuity patients bringing bonuses. Back then, I thought she was joking. Now the words burned. Evan passed by, pausing at the door. "You're still digging?" he asked, eyes weary, voice gentler than before. I wanted to tell him I wasn't digging, I was drowning, but I just nodded. "I need to understand," I said. He sighed. "Sometimes it's better not to." The silence between us thickened. After he went to bed, I scrolled through insurance statements on my phone, cross-checking codes I didn't recognize. "Severe anxiety episode," one read. Another claimed I'd undergone breathing therapy. I hadn't. I'd barely been believed. My hands shook as I typed my name into a patient advocacy site, searching for others who'd felt erased. Stories surfaced, different doctors, same patterns, rushed visits, fake entries, phantom billing. The words blurred into one another until my screen dimmed and I saw my reflection, tired eyes, shallow breaths, a woman halfway to truth. The next morning, I returned to the clinic. The receptionist's smile faltered when she saw me. "Records department's under maintenance," she said too quickly. "Come back next week." Her fingers twitched toward a file drawer but stopped short, as if trained not to touch it. I thanked her anyway and walked out, the smell of antiseptic following me like a warning. Outside, wind tore through the parking lot, carrying leaves across the pavement like small escapes. I stopped, staring at the mirrored glass doors, my own reflection split by the clinic's logo. I didn't feel small anymore. I felt sharp. I knew that whatever game they were playing, I wasn't their patient anymore, I was their evidence. At home, I gathered my notes into a binder, labeling each section with a trembling hand. Appointments, billing, edits. My handwriting steadied with each page. The fear that once hollowed me began to turn into something harder, cleaner. The doctor's laugh still echoed in memory, but now it sounded distant, almost scared. "I have to know the truth," I repeated, this time not as a whisper, but a promise. The first clue came disguised as routine. A courier receipt tucked inside a mailed invoice listed a specimen pickup from my address on a date I'd never given blood. The signature, scrawled in thick ink, wasn't mine. My throat tightened. I drove to the pharmacy, hoping it was a clerical error. The pharmacist smiled kindly but hesitated when she looked at the system. "It says you filled an antidepressant here last month," she said quietly. "Refill due next week." I felt my stomach drop. "I've never taken those," I replied. She frowned. "Then someone else used your file." Her tone carried pity, not disbelief. I left with shaking hands, the receipt folded in my pocket like a secret waiting to scream. That night the pain returned stronger. I pressed a hot cloth against my side, watching the city lights through the blinds. The laughter, the dismissal, it all replayed like a cruel joke stretched across time. Evan was asleep on the couch, his laptop open beside him. I thought of waking him but didn't. Instead, I opened a notebook and began writing every strange thing I'd noticed. The courier date, the prescription, the automated emails. The page filled fast. The more I wrote, the more I remembered. The nurse's unease, the receptionist's twitch, the missing lab results. I drew red stars beside each entry, marking what I couldn't explain. The next morning I walked to the mailbox and found a glossy flyer from the hospital celebrating excellence in care. Dr. Preston Vale, Patient Champion of the Year. My fingers trembled as I tore it apart. Inside the pieces, I found a photo of him smiling beside the director, hand on a plaque. My ribs throbbed. The irony was too much to bear. I threw the scraps into the sink and turned on the tap, watching the ink bleed down the drain. Later that day, my neighbor, Mrs. Clark, called across the fence. "You know that fancy doctor at your clinic? He won some raffle thing," she said, laughing. "Free cruise or something for best patient ratings." Her words pierced. I smiled weakly and excused myself, heart pounding. As night fell, I sat by the window, listening to the hum of cars, the low buzz of a world that didn't care if one woman vanished inside paperwork. I thought back to being 13, sitting beside my mother in the free clinic. Downtown, the air smelled of rubbing alcohol and soap. A volunteer doctor had asked how she felt, and she'd answered, "Better, thank you." When we left, she whispered, "Always ask the second question. Are you sure?" It felt like a prophecy now. I closed my notebook, whispering the same words to the dark. "Are you sure, Dr. Vale?" Days turned into a blur of research. I joined online forums for patient errors, read about data tampering and insurance fraud. Each story mirrored mine too closely to ignore. I learned that system edits left digital fingerprints, timestamps, user IDs, hidden trails even administrators overlooked. My paranoia turned into purpose. I started tracking my online logins, saving screenshots of every timestamp. I even printed the browser's metadata, circling Vale's name in the audit column like a signature of guilt. Evan noticed the growing piles of paper and said, "You're scaring me, Nadia." I met his gaze, steady now. "Good," I said. "Maybe that means I'm finally onto something." That night, as wind rattled the window frames, I stared at the ceiling and whispered to the dark, "You're not sick." It sounded different now, not an insult, but a warning. The fear that had once paralyzed me was fading, replaced by something colder, sharper. My pulse slowed. My focus tightened. The laugh was still there in memory, but I no longer flinched. I was learning how to fight in silence. I woke before dawn, the house quiet except for the low hum of the fridge. The binder on the kitchen table looked heavier than paper had a right to be. For weeks I'd been scared of what I might find. Now I was terrified of what I already knew. Fear was no longer enough, it was time to move. I opened my laptop, typing slowly through exhaustion. First, I searched for how to obtain full medical records under state law. Second, I looked up how to view insurance data logs. My search history read like a survival manual. Every new discovery tightened something inside me. Not panic this time, precision. By noon, I was calling numbers I'd never thought I'd need. The insurance agent's voice was smooth, too polite. "According to our system," she said, "you had an emergency room visit 6 weeks ago." My fingers gripped the phone so hard it creaked. "No, I didn't," I said quietly. She paused. "Well, it's billed under your name. Dr. Vale coded it personally." My breath stuttered. I asked for documentation, and she emailed it within minutes. There it was. Charges, diagnostics, medications I'd never seen. He had fabricated an entire visit. The bill even included my supposed improvement. I forwarded it to myself twice, terrified it might vanish. When Evan came home, I was sitting at the table surrounded by papers, red ink circling every lie. "You've been here all day?" he asked softly. I nodded, eyes fixed on the screen. "They made me a ghost," I said. "A profitable ghost." He rubbed his temples. "Nadia, maybe it's an error." I cut him off, voice steady. "No more maybes. Not this time." His mouth tightened. "You're scaring me." I met his eyes, realizing for the first time that his fear wasn't for me, it was for himself, for what this truth might break open. I emailed the clinic's records department again, asking for access logs. The reply came within minutes. "Due to ongoing maintenance, records are unavailable." I almost laughed. It was always maintenance, always delay. I didn't respond. Instead, I began reading about data subpoenas, chain of custody procedures, and how medical audit trails are stored. The words became a new language, one I was starting to understand. My fear began to shrink. My resolve grew teeth. I began to dress differently for these small investigations, structured jackets, tied hair, dark lipstick, like armor. The next morning, I drove to the insurance office, binder on the seat beside me. The clerk behind the counter blinked as I laid everything down. "I think I've been billed for services I never received," I said. My voice didn't shake. She skimmed the papers, her brows knitting tighter with every page. "These codes are for inpatient treatment," she murmured. "That can't be right." Her words were gasoline. I thanked her, left calmly, and sat in my car shaking. I stared at the steering wheel until the shaking stopped. Then I smiled, small, grim, unbreakable. That night, I rewrote my notes, labeling each lie, each pattern. The fear that had ruled my nights was gone. It wasn't courage exactly, it was calculation. I knew what to do now. Tomorrow, I'd find someone who could help me tear the rest open, someone outside their system. I turned off the light, feeling my breath steady in my chest. "I'm done being afraid," I whispered. In the dark, it sounded like a declaration. Tessa Morell entered my life like a blade wrapped in silk. I found her through a late-night forum thread where someone mentioned her name under a story titled, "The Doctor Who Vanished My Records." She was a journalist now, but she'd been a nurse once, and her messages were sharp, efficient, and alarmingly direct. "Meet me somewhere quiet," she'd written. "Bring everything. Don't email it again." We met at a cafe near the harbor, the kind of place where the sea breeze mixed with burnt espresso, and nobody looked twice at two women talking in low voices. She looked mid-30s, freckled, with eyes that caught everything. I slid the binder across the table, and she opened it without hesitation. For several minutes, the only sound was paper shifting and her quiet exhale when she reached the forged ER bill. "You're not paranoid," she said finally. "You're recorded." Her tone was matter-of-fact, not comforting. "They edited your chart. Happens more than you'd think. They call it streamlining. I call it fraud." My throat tightened. "Can it be proven?" I asked. Tessa nodded slowly. "Every keystroke leaves a fingerprint. Audit logs, timestamps, access points if he changed anything. There'll be a trace." I watched her scribble notes, her pen tapping when she thought. We'll need access requests, insurer statements, and ideally a hospital contact who owes me a favor, she said. Her confidence was unnerving, but it gave me oxygen. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. Over the next week, Tessa and I became a quiet machine. We created a burner email for whistleblower tips, registered under an alias she picked, Mei Lin. Short for my grandmother, she said. She didn't take lies either. She showed me how to draft Freedom of Information requests for malpractice settlements and how to word them so the state couldn't ignore them. We mapped Vale's hospital affiliations, his continuing education sponsors, and his donor dinners. Each breadcrumb painted a clearer picture, not of a careless doctor, but of a system groomed to look perfect while hiding rot. Late one night, Tessa brought her old laptop, its surface covered in faded stickers. Audit logs use something called HL7, she explained, typing fast. It's like a black box for patient records. If we can get even one day's export, I can show you who touched what. She glanced up. Ever seen your access report? I shook my head. Then that's where we start. Together, we wrote a letter demanding a full audit under patient rights law. Her eyes gleamed. They'll ignore it first, then we'll make them wish they hadn't. Meanwhile, I started to notice how careful Tessa was. She never parked near the same place twice. She used a prepaid phone and never mentioned where she lived. Once, she looked at me and said, "People disappear under data, Nadia. The trick is to leave proof that you existed before they try." Her words lingered long after she left that night. I stared at my data, a reflection in the window, thinking how I'd become both patient and detective, both ghost and witness. By the weekend, we had a wall of evidence pinned across my living room printouts, maps, sticky notes, courier schedules. Evan watched from the doorway, distant, unsure. "Is this safe?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. The truth was heavier than safety. Tessa's final message before leaving that night was simple: "Next week, we pull the thread." And as I watched her taillights fade down the street, I knew something irreversible had begun. I wasn't chasing a doctor anymore. I was unraveling an empire built on silence. 3 days later, Tessa arrived with a USB drive shaped like a brass key. She dropped it on my table between 2 mugs of untouched coffee. "This," she said softly, "is your first proof." My pulse stuttered. She plugged it into her laptop, the screen filling with rows of codes and timestamps that looked like static to me but poetry to her. "Look here," she murmured, pointing to a line. "Chart access at 2:19 a.m., under Vale's credentials. But at that time, he was logged into a conference live stream in Miami. It's recorded." She zoomed in, highlighting the digital fingerprint. "He or someone using his ID edited your record. That's tampering." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "So he knew?" She glanced up, eyes steady. "He didn't just know. He planned for nobody to notice." We scrolled further, uncovering patterns hidden in plain sight. A cluster of edits marked at exact 5-minute intervals across multiple patient files, all bearing identical diagnosis codes, mine among them. "Batch uploads," Tessa muttered. "He's doing this to boost compliance metrics. More chronic anxiety means higher reimbursements." My head spun. "So my pain never mattered," I said. "It was just data." Tessa didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. That night, I sat on the couch, holding the printed logs, the paper trembling in my hands. Proof should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like grief. The laugh, the dismissal, it all rewound through my mind until I could hear the exact pitch of it again. I imagined him sitting in his office, maybe eating lunch, maybe joking with a nurse, while erasing me line by line. It made me sick. I barely noticed the tears until one fell onto the page, smearing ink over his name. Evan found me there hours later. "You haven't slept," he said quietly. His voice was softer now, wary. I showed him the log. "He changed it," I whispered. "He deleted evidence of tests that never existed." Evan's face shifted: shock, then guilt, then something unreadable. "Maybe he made a mistake," he said. "People make mistakes." I shook my head slowly. "Not at 2 a.m, not across 20 charts." He had no answer. He just stepped back, eyes darting toward the hallway like he needed to escape the weight of my words. Tessa texted later that night. "Found another link. Check the state database for nurse complaints. Search Vale 2020. I did. The page loaded slowly, but when it did, I froze. There it was, a redacted report from an anonymous nurse. Patient safety compromised. Edits made under instruction to optimize metrics. Supervisor dismissed concern. The nurse had been reassigned. My heart clenched. Someone else had tried to stop him and paid for it. The next morning, I printed everything again. My apartment was a paper storm, evidence of betrayal taped to every wall. Fear still lingered, but it had changed flavor. It was no longer the kind that stopped me from breathing. It was the kind that pushed me forward. I stared at the pile of pages and thought, he took my voice. Now I'll take his mask. As sunlight spilled across the table, I realized there was no turning back. I was no longer a victim with a chart to correct. I was a witness with proof to destroy him. A whistleblower packet arrived in my burner email at 2 a.m. It contained internal emails, donation lists, and a scanned lab inventory sheet. The emails talked about fast-tracking complaints and adjusting codes to impress auditors. A donor dinner menu showed Vale sitting beside a major insurer executive. The lab sheet listed my specimen as missing while another patient's arrived. Then the packet dropped a recording of a staff meeting about hitting numbers. In the recording, a voice I recognized instructed nurses to mark vitals desirable. My stomach turned as the voice joked that outcomes sell better than care. When I played the conference live stream, the timestamp proved Vale's credentials accessed records. Everything collapsed inward like a house of bones. The betrayal was vast. When the full picture came into focus, it almost broke me. The truth wasn't just about one man's cruelty, it was about everyone who'd let him thrive. I stared at the printed emails. Spread across my table, the pages curling at the edges from sweat and coffee stains. One line repeated in my head, from a message between Vale and the hospital's billing director. Patients love a hero, not a statistic. Make sure her anxiety code sticks. My breath hitched. Her. That was me. I felt dizzy, the room tilting. I pressed my palms flat against the table, willing the ground to stay still. I confronted Evan that evening, my hands trembling but my voice calm. You knew, I said quietly. He looked up from his laptop, confusion flickering, then fading into guilt. Knew what? I slid the printed email toward him. You told him to mark anxiety instead of further testing, said it'd help keep our premiums low. His face drained of color. I didn't know he began, but I cut him off. You didn't ask what he'd do. You just wanted it cheaper. The silence that followed felt louder than any scream. He stood there, eyes glassy, and said, I thought it was harmless. The word harmless hit like glass. I walked out onto the balcony, wind slicing through my hair, tears stinging as they met the cold air. Below, the city lights looked distant, indifferent. Inside, Evan sank into the couch, staring at nothing. I didn't hate him, not yet, but the betrayal carved something hollow inside me. The person who was supposed to protect me had traded truth for convenience. The man who'd sworn in sickness and in health decided I wasn't sick enough to matter. That night, I dreamed of the clinic again, the laughter, the glare of the lights, the way Vale had stood too close, hand on the door like he owned the exit. I woke up gasping, ribs aching, sheets tangled. The world outside my window was gray, empty of meaning. I made coffee and sat on the floor surrounded by evidence, tracing each connection, each lie, until I couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. Tessa's text arrived just before dawn. This isn't just him. It's a network. You have enough to start something big. But be ready, it'll get ugly. I looked around the apartment, Evan's empty mug, the unpaid bills, the quiet that used to feel like peace. Everything I'd built on trust had cracked. I wasn't sure who I was anymore, but I knew what I had to do. The tears came again, slower this time, cleaner. I wasn't crying for loss. I was crying for clarity. The pieces of me that had doubted were gone. In their place was something sharper, steadier, a new kind of strength that didn't ask permission to exist. I wiped my face and whispered into the quiet, no more lies. Then, with hands still trembling but sure, I began to plan. I returned to the lighthouse path, running before dawn with measured breaths. Cold salt wind hit my face and sharpened every worn thought. My feet found rhythm, and my mind cataloged tiny, stubborn victories. I labeled each paper, placed evidence like shells in a box. The binder grew. Heavier, but my hands no longer shook uncontrollably. Tessa taught me to photograph pages beside dated newspapers for proof. We tracked courier routes and matched them against lab inventory timestamps. I practiced asking precise questions until my voice sounded like steel. Each small ritual steadied me and pushed panic a step backward. At home, I bought a cheap barcode scanner from an online marketplace. It beeped clumsily but read wristbands and labels with stubborn accuracy. I learned how wristband numbers map to MRNs and hidden logs. Testing showed how easy it was to swap identifiers between charts. Tessa watched me work, offering quiet corrections and small, sharp grins. We compared cafeteria receipts against audit logs for matching timestamps. Sometimes the trail narrowed to a single overlooked cursor movement. Those tiny ghosts of activity were more damning than loud accusations. I learned to photograph hands typing, not faces, to avoid attention. One afternoon I carried flour, it in my arms, to the small kitchen. My mother used to make bread when nights felt too loud or crooked. I mixed salt and yeast, folding worries between gentle palms like dough. The act of kneading measured my pulse and calmed my hands. While dough rose, I reviewed timelines, each date pinned like coin. The kitchen smelled of yeast and evidence, oddly comforting in union. I baked a small loaf, then placed it beside my growing folder. Symbolic calm steadied me. The simple ritual grounded my frantic plans. Evan watched from the doorway, silent and uncertain about his part. Tessa found an attorney who specialized in medical data malpractice and privacy. He listened without interrupting, eyes steady over a well-worn briefcase. We discussed subpoenas, chain of custody procedures, and protective orders for whistleblowers. He advised slow pressure, legal steps timed with public disclosures. Tessa coordinated with a reporter ally to prepare an embargoed release. We built a private cloud of documents accessible only through encrypted keys. I memorized each contact's name should devices be confiscated overnight. There was comfort in contingency, a map with multiple escape routes. My anger cooled into strategy, precise and patient as a ticking clock. Each day I added proofs to the box, a growing archive of wrongs. I labeled USBs with mundane tags to lower suspicion in transit. At night, I reread my mother's advice and folded it into plans. The lighthouse runs reminded me that light returns even after long darkness. My binder was no longer a symbol. It became a weapon of truth. Tessa stayed relentless, her calm fury shaping the next necessary move. I slept less, not from anxiety, but from disciplined readiness and focus. The plan felt righteous, not vengeful. My aim remained accountability, not revenge. I kissed Evan one morning, tasting both forgiveness and sharp new distance. Then I closed the binder, feeling ready to pull the next thread. Tessa called it Operation Seabright, named after the annual black tie gala held by the hospital. "If you want justice," she said, "you have to make people watch it happen." Her tone was calm, but her eyes glowed with the quiet thrill of risk. The gala would celebrate innovation and philanthropy, Vale's favorite stage. His award speech would stream live on hospital social media. I imagined his smile under the lights, the self-congratulating applause. I wanted that to be the moment everything cracked. We began designing the plan like architects of truth, every detail etched in secrecy. First, the bait, a donation item at the silent auction called the Executive Wellness Package. Tessa helped me craft its description: exclusive diagnostic experience, personalized metrics, full privacy assurance. We included a QR code on a placard that linked to a hidden web page we built together. It was simple on the surface, but under the code, a program waited. When scanned within the gala's Wi-Fi range, it would trigger simultaneous releases, copies of the audit logs, whistleblower emails, and evidence packets sent to journalists, insurers, and regulatory boards. The web page would only activate inside the ballroom's geofence, locking it to the people most responsible. I spent nights coding the redirect with tutorials and trembling fingers. The trigger timing depended on Vale's speech slot, synced through the public event schedule. "This isn't about humiliation," Tessa reminded me. "It's about exposure." But part of me knew it was both. I wanted him to feel what I felt that day in his office, cornered, disbelieved, stripped of control. My revenge wasn't a scream. It was a mirror. Next, the disguise. I applied as a catering assistant through a temp agency, using a fake resume and borrowed uniform. Tessa would attend as press, covering the event under her own credentials. I'd move among the servers unseen, placing a backup QR code inside the printed gala programs. I memorized the layout of the ballroom, the position of the projectors, the route from AV riser to backstage control. Each movement was rehearsed, timed, and silent. "You've turned anxiety into choreography," Tessa joked one night, smiling faintly. I smiled back. That's the only kind of therapy I trust now. Days before the event, I delivered an encrypted thumb drive to the malpractice attorney. "If anything happens," I said, "send this to the board and Tessa." He nodded gravely, slipping it into a safe envelope. Every step tightened the web. Each piece was placed with surgical care, nothing random, nothing emotional. For the first time in months, I felt in control. I could finally breathe without counting. The night before the gala, I stood by the window, the city glittering like 1,000 blinking monitors. Evan approached quietly. "You're really going through with this?" he asked. His voice carried fear, maybe regret. "Yes," I said simply. "Someone has to." He nodded once, defeated. "Then make sure it hurts the right people." I didn't answer. My reflection in the glass looked calm, almost serene. The storm wasn't outside anymore, it was me. When I finally closed the laptop, the script was ready, the code tested, the evidence secure. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the rhythm of the ocean faint in the distance. Tomorrow, everything would burn, but it would be a cleansing fire. Not chaos, not revenge for its own sake, just truth, unveiled in the place that thought it was untouchable. And somewhere, deep beneath the exhaustion, a strange peace began to grow. The gala night felt larger than a single accusation against one man. I packed the small bag with tools that would betray polished surfaces. A cheap barcode scanner nestled beside an engraved pocket knife and tape. I tested wristband codes until my thumbs ached from endless scans. Each beep sounded like a small victory against quiet institutional theft. Tessa handed me a lanyard with press credentials printed under another name. She moved like someone carrying both courage and careful secrets. Her voice was low when she told me the final synchronization time. We rehearsed the timing until the code and speech matched precisely. Night made the apartment intimate and conspiratorial and terribly real. I sewed a tiny QR into the program pages with invisible thread. The QR looked innocent, a graphic waiting for phones to linger. Underneath, code slept like a coiled spring ready to explode. I taped a backup thumb drive beneath the AV riser, heart pounding. The drive contained redacted logs and a chain of custody trail I compiled. If electronic channels failed, paper proof would shatter sterile myths. I rehearsed a false spill sequence to distract security with plausible clumsiness. A spilled tray would reroute attention to servers and toward my angle. My palms smelled of sanitizer and coffee, a mixture of nerves and focus. Breath measured, I checked each connection until nothing felt uncertain. The catering uniform hid my lanyard and kept movements unremarkable. I practiced a smile that looked helpful without inviting questions. On the day, the hospital shimmered under chandeliers and expensive cologne. Staff moved in rehearsed patterns, polite and almost mechanical in kindness. I kept a steady pace, eyes scanning for cameras and for lax hands. Every glance could be a threat or an invitation to be seen. Tessa found me at the rear door, whispering final instructions like a general. She handed me a napkin folded into a tiny square with a code. Her eyes held a quiet fire that steadied my own trembling fingers. I nodded, the signal passing between us like practiced punctuation. Backstage smelled of cables, solder, and the sweet metallic tang of stress. Sound engineers muttered about buffers and live feeds while adjusting levels. I slipped the thumb drive into a panel, palms steady despite noise. The drive hummed a quiet promise as the technician turned his back. Outside, the ballroom filled with laughter, crystal clinking, and soft applause. I tightened my grip on the scanner, counting breaths in slow, exact rhythm. The QR in the program waited, pixel perfect, harmless as printed ink. My heart pounded as if rehearsing for a role it had never played. I thought of my mother's hands folding bandages, steady and kind. That image anchored me. A private lighthouse in a room of noise. Tessa whispered, "We go live at 9. Be ready for the applause." Her voice slid through the crackle of monitors like a practice spell. I breathed and checked the clock, fingers tracing the scanner's cold edge. Security rounds passed near the AV door, each step a needle of tension. My role was small, invisible, precise, and crucial to the unfolding proof. I tested the geofence one last time using a disposable phone's GPS. The map lit briefly, showing a blue ring around the ballroom's heart. It felt like watching a second. Hand hunger for the perfect moment. I swallowed hard, tasting metal and sugar, my throat dry and focused. This was justice rehearsed, not revenge born of sudden flame. At 8:58, the ballroom lights dimmed, candles flickering like held breaths. Servers moved through aisles, trays balancing like practiced soldiers of etiquette. I stayed near the back, scanning phones as patrons casually passed programs. Two trustees paused and scanned the QR with bored curiosity, unaware. My code triggered softly, a ripple through a quiet digital pond. Emails flowed out like confetti, to press, board members, and insurers. The projector hummed as Vale stood, hand smoothing his jacket before speaking. His grin found the room, and the room returned his practiced admiration. I watched Tessa raise her phone, fingers steady, eyes cold and bright. Then the ballroom began to change in the smallest, most seismic ways. Screens around the room flickered as documents replaced the auction preview image. A hush fell, like a physical force pushing down polished chatter. Phones buzzed repeatedly with attached PDFs named by dates and edits. Someone gasped, the sound sharp and instant like broken glass. Vale faltered mid-sentence as an audio clip looped through the PA system. His whispered instruction, deny, delay, delete, hung heavy and impossible to explain. Trustee phones lit with redacted emails and time-stamped audit logs, undeniable. The room shuddered with realization, and the polite masks began to crack. I felt a strange weight lift as the evidence became visible and loud. Even from the back, I could see Vale's face pale like wet paper. He tried to laugh it off, voice a thin shield against rising fury. Board members murmured, eyes darting between screens and the man on stage. A trustee demanded an explanation, voice steady but edged with betrayal. Vale's speech shattered, words tripping over evidence like thin glass. Security moved faster now, confusion replacing rehearsed. Hospitality and smiles. Some guests stood to leave, others remained, faces flushed with shock. In the chaos, I slipped back to the riser, heart wild and steady. Tessa met my eye with something like triumph and deep, tired relief. We had not screamed. We had shown the ledger and let truth speak. Outside, ambulance lights painted the hotel walls in urgent, honest colors. The room erupted in the quietest kind of chaos, the kind where nobody screams, but every breath feels stolen. Vale stood frozen beneath the stage lights, his jaw tight, eyes darting from one glowing screen to another. The audio loop kept playing, his own voice, deny, delay, delete, repeating like a curse over the expensive violin music that still tried to fill the air. Guests clutched their phones, scrolling through the files that exposed years of falsified records, fake patient charts, inflated reimbursements. Someone shouted for IT, another for security. Cameras flashed as if truth had become the evening's entertainment. And there, at the center of it all, Vale's practiced smile cracked wide open into panic. I stayed in motion, invisible among the staff, carrying trays that no one noticed. Each step kept time with the heartbeat in my ears. Tessa's phone blinked green from the back corner, our signal that the uploads were complete. The hospital's cloud mirrored every document to the reporters we'd chosen. In less than a minute, the story would outlive both of us. "It's done," she whispered through her earpiece. My knees nearly buckled from the flood of adrenaline, but I kept walking, head down, eyes dry. I couldn't afford satisfaction yet. Revenge isn't sweet, it's sterile, surgical, necessary. Vale grabbed the microphone, trying to drown the loop with forced laughter. "We're experiencing a technical disturbance," he said, his voice cracking mid-sentence. No one laughed. One of the trustees, a tall woman in a blue sequined gown, stood abruptly. "Doctor." "Vale," she said sharply. "These files have our names on them. Explain this," he stammered, the microphone squealing as feedback pierced the air. "This is sabotage," he yelled. None of this is real. His denial collided with the wall of screens behind him, screens displaying timestamps signed by his own login credentials. Every lie he'd told now glowed 10 feet high in front of his peers. A man from the IT team ran toward the AV booth, panic in his step. "Cut the feed!" he shouted. But the feed wasn't theirs anymore. It had been rerouted through the external network I'd set. He jabbed at the controls, but each attempt only mirrored the chaos onto the building's outdoor display. Passers-by on the street stopped to watch medical charts scroll across the marquee, the words "Data Fraud Investigation Pending" flashing in bold red. Inside, the silence cracked into frantic whispers. The board chair looked like he'd aged 10 years in 5 minutes. Security reached for Vale's arm, but he pulled away, eyes wild. "You don't understand," he barked. "This is manipulation. They've twisted my dot." The audio cut him off with his own voice again. "Make sure her anxiety code sticks." A few guests gasped aloud. One woman, clutching her clutch to her chest, whispered, "That's her. That's the woman he mocked." I froze, realizing she was pointing at me, heads turned. Tessa's voice buzzed in my earpiece. "You're exposed. Get out now." I moved fast, slipping through the service corridor that smelled of bleach and roses. My steps echoed against the tile. Behind me, the sound of confusion grew distant, replaced by the static buzz of truth catching fire. Outside, the night air hit my face like a blessing. I tore off the catering jacket, dropped it into the dumpster, and pulled on the hoodie I'd stashed earlier. The ocean wind tangled my hair as I walked toward the parking lot where Tessa waited in her car, engine running. She grinned when she saw me, exhaustion and triumph mixing in her eyes. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," I corrected, my voice shaking. We drove without speaking, city lights fading behind us. My phone buzzed nonstop notifications, mentions, messages from unknown numbers. One headline already read, "Hospital Hero Exposed. Audit Scandal Rocks. Seabright Medical." I watched the screen for a moment, then turned it face down on my lap. The revenge had unfolded exactly as planned, but the victory felt heavy, bittersweet. "He'll lose his license," Tessa said, as if trying to convince me it was enough. I nodded, staring at the passing streetlights. "He'll lose everything," I whispered. When we reached the overlook above the bay, I stepped out, cold air wrapping around me. Below, the city pulsed with the fallout of truth. Somewhere in that chaos, Dr. Preston Vale was facing the same helplessness he'd once left me with: the disbelief, the isolation, the sting of being dismissed. I closed my eyes, hearing his laugh one last time, but now it held no power. It was just noise, empty and fading. I looked at Tessa and said, "Now he knows what it feels like to be unheard." She nodded, her face solemn. As dawn began to creep over the water, I finally exhaled. The trap was sprung, the reckoning in motion. Revenge had turned into revelation, and for the first time in months, I felt my ribs expand without pain, my lungs filling fully, cleanly. The laughter that once haunted me had been replaced by the sound of the ocean, steady, endless, and true. By sunrise, the hospital's front lawn was a battlefield of cameras and microphones. Reporters crowded the entrance, shouting questions that bounced off glass doors and frightened staff. Headlines flashed across every screen before breakfast. Seabright scandal. Doctor accused of data tampering and fraud. The media storm moved fast, devouring every statement, every leak. Vale's photo filled the morning news cycle. Once confident, now pale and cornered. The hospital released a thin statement about temporary administrative leave pending investigation. Patients began flooding online forums, comparing records, realizing their own data didn't match. My name wasn't mentioned yet, but it was only a matter of time. I sat in the kitchen, watching it unfold in real time. Evan entered quietly, holding 2 mugs of coffee, eyes red from sleeplessness. "They're saying he's under investigation by the board," he said softly. I nodded without looking up. "It's only the beginning." He hesitated, then added, "I gave a statement." I turned to him, uncertain. "What kind?" He swallowed hard. "The truth. About the insurance forms. About asking him to minimize it." His voice cracked. I didn't know what he'd do with that. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then, finally, I whispered, "I believe you didn't mean harm, but you still became part of his lie." His eyes lowered, shame spreading through his face like ink through water. Outside, social media burned with accusations and disbelief. Former nurses from Vale's department began speaking up, sharing memories of data revisions and metric adjustments. One said she'd been reprimanded for reporting inconsistencies. Another posted a blurred photo of Vale's handwritten note, "Compliance before complaints." The story was unstoppable now. Even the hospital's PR spin collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. They had built their empire on perception, and I had handed them a mirror they couldn't look away from. That evening, a camera crew arrived outside our building. I closed the blinds while Tessa texted updates from her newsroom. "State Board opening a full investigation," she wrote. "FBI Healthcare Fraud Division already looped in. He's finished." Her next message carried a softer tone. "You okay?" I stared at the blinking cursor before. Typing back, "Not yet, but getting there." She didn't reply, and she didn't need to. We both knew justice wasn't a single event. It was a long, messy unraveling. 2 days later, the hospital announced Vale's medical license had been suspended pending disciplinary review. The board's statement included words like forgery, data manipulation, and criminal referral. He was escorted out by security while reporters shouted his name. A video surfaced of him pushing cameras aside, shouting that he was framed. But truth doesn't need volume, it just waits until denial exhausts itself. Watching that clip, I felt neither joy nor pity. Only closure, clean and absolute. But exposure has its ripples. Donors withdrew funding. The hospital's CEO resigned for health reasons. Lawsuits bloomed overnight like weeds in spring. Patients demanded audits of their own records, creating a wave no PR department could contain. For every lie Vale had written, 100 truths surfaced to bury it. My inbox filled with messages from strangers, some thanking me, others asking how to begin their own fights. I read each one carefully, knowing what their disbelief felt like, how heavy silence could be. One afternoon, I stepped outside for the first time in days. The sky was bright, the wind soft, carrying the sound of gulls and distant sirens. Across the street, a woman nodded at me, a nurse I recognized from the clinic. She didn't speak, but her eyes said enough. She knew. The world had shifted, and somehow, I had become part of that change. For the first time, I didn't feel small beneath it. When I came home, I found Evan sitting with an old photo of us from our wedding. "Do you hate me?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. "No, I just see you clearly now." He nodded, tears forming but never falling. "Maybe that's enough," he said. Maybe it was. The news carried Vale's final statement that night, something about personal attacks and emotional patience. It didn't matter. His words, once sharp as needles, now sounded dull and desperate. The world had stopped listening to him, the way he had once stopped listening to me. The following week moved like smoke, thick, slow, impossible to hold. Vale's face vanished from the hospital's website overnight. His office door, once polished and lined with awards, now carried a strip of yellow tape that read, "Under review." Tessa sent me photos from the press conference. Board officials at a long table, microphones glinting, reporters leaning forward like wolves. One by one, they announced suspensions, audits, and a sweeping compliance overhaul. It was the kind of justice that didn't need fireworks, just signatures and silence. I watched it unfold on my phone with steady hands, no longer trembling. He'd been stripped of his title, but the real punishment wasn't in the paperwork, it was in the collapse of his certainty. When reporters tried to find him, they discovered he'd fled town, citing medical leave. His colleagues called it burnout. I called it consequence. The board's report leaked days later, confirming every suspicion: fabricated records, falsified visits, altered lab results, and unethical collaborations with administrators. Tessa's article went viral within hours. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the system that had rewarded deceit and punished doubt. My name appeared in one paragraph, anonymous but unmistakable. A patient known only as N provided evidence leading to the exposure. Seeing it written made my chest ache, but not from pain, from release. Evan read the article at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "You did it," he said quietly. I shook my head. "We did it," I replied, though we both knew I meant Tessa, the nurses, the whistleblower, all those who refused to stay silent. He smiled faintly, sadness still threading his voice. "So, what happens? Now?" I exhaled slowly. "Now, we rebuild." The next few days blurred into statements, depositions, and meetings with lawyers. Each document I signed felt like peeling away another layer of the lie. Tessa worked with me to establish a trust fund using the settlement advance, a resource for patients facing similar cover-ups. "If we're going to burn something down," she said, "we better build something in its place." Her words became a mantra. I funneled every potential reward, every dollar meant for revenge, into that foundation. Justice to me was never about money. It was about proof that truth could still live in systems designed to bury it. When the press finally reached out for an interview, I declined. "No camera can capture what it cost," I told Tessa. She nodded, understanding instantly. She wrote the final piece with restraint, describing me only as a woman who refused to be rewritten. It was perfect. Quiet, powerful, enough. Weeks later, the world moved on, as it always does. Another scandal took headlines, another story replaced ours. But the damage at Seabright lingered. Donors pulled out. Patients demanded open access to their charts. The board chair resigned, and Vale, last I heard, was fighting to keep his license, though everyone knew it was already gone. One evening, I walked past the clinic where it all began. The lights were dim, the waiting room empty. A new doctor's nameplate hung where his used to be. For a long time, I just stood there, listening to the hum of the vending machine and the echo of footsteps down the hall. The memory of that laugh still tried to surface, but it no longer hurt. It just sounded small. When I returned home, the sky was a deep, calm blue. Evan was cooking something simple, humble. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The silence between us had softened. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the city. Lights flickered on in the distance, one by one, like cautious hope. Justice hadn't restored what I'd lost, but it had given shape to something new. Truth, once buried, now lived in documents and headlines and the quiet resolve of everyone who refused to look away. I wasn't the same woman who'd sat trembling in that examination room months ago. I was something different now, something unbreakable. Months passed, and the world slowly rearranged itself around me. I moved to a smaller apartment near the coast, where mornings smelled like salt and clean air instead of antiseptic. Each dawn, I laced my shoes and ran the lighthouse path again, the same one I'd once used to breathe through anger. But this time, it wasn't escape, it was return. My lungs opened wide, the ache in my ribs finally quiet. The sea glittered against pale light, each wave reminding me that endings could sound like beginnings if you listen long enough. I began volunteering twice a week at a small community clinic downtown. The place reminded me of where my mother used to take me. No suits, no donors, just weary faces and real conversations. I showed patients how to download their audit histories, how to keep physical copies, how to ask questions without apology. Some came just to talk about fear, about the feeling of being dismissed. I told them that fear was proof of sanity, not weakness, that asking again, asking louder, was not rudeness, it was survival. The staff started calling me the Quiet Storm, a title that made me smile every time. Tessa visited occasionally, her notebook always half full, her eyes still carrying that investigative gleam. We'd sit on the clinic steps drinking coffee from paper cups. "You know," she said once, "people think revenge is fire. But you made it paperwork." I laughed, shaking my head. "Paper burns slower," I said, "long enough for others to see the smoke." She grinned at that, tapping her pen against her knee. Our conversations always drifted toward the future, toward what systems might change next. Evan and I stayed civil, even kind. Sometimes we met for lunch, talking about ordinary things, the weather, work, nothing that could wound. We didn't try to rebuild what was gone. Instead, we honored what had existed before it broke. It was peaceful in its honesty. He still carried guilt in his eyes, but I stopped trying to lift it from him. Some weights aren't meant to be shared. At night, I'd light a candle and read old letters from patients who'd written after the scandal. One said, "You made me check my chart." They'd marked me as stable when I wasn't. "Now I'm getting real help." Another read, "Thank you for proving we aren't invisible." Those words became my quiet reward, my measure of healing. Not applause, not headlines, just proof that voices, once found, echo further than expected. I still visit the ocean when the noise of life grows heavy. I stand at the edge, shoes off, letting cold water rush over my feet. Sometimes I whisper to the wind, "You're not sick," just to hear how harmless it sounds now. The phrase that once broke me has become a reminder of disbelief turned into truth, of silence turned into action. Peace, I've learned, doesn't arrive like forgiveness. It grows, one steady breath at a time, until it fills the space where pain used to live. Some stories end in noise, but mine settled into stillness. Months after the scandal, I found rhythm again, simple, quiet, unremarkable to anyone else but me. I woke early, brewed coffee, and listened to the hum of the city outside my window. Every sound felt honest now. No more coded words or hidden edits, just life unfolding at its natural pace. I began journaling each morning, not to revisit the pain but to trace how far I'd walked away from it. The pages filled with gratitude for ordinary moments. A stranger's smile at the bus stop, a child laughing in the clinic hallway, the smell of rain against new pavement. Healing wasn't loud, it was steady. Tessa's foundation took shape faster than either of us expected. We called it Patient Signal, a place for people to share their experiences without fear. Reporters, nurses, and lawyers volunteered. The first story published under its banner exposed another hospital's manipulation of patient wait times. It felt surreal to see truth ripple outward like that, alive and multiplying. When she asked me to give a talk at a journalism conference, I hesitated. Public speaking had always terrified me, but when I stood behind the podium, looking out at a sea of expectant faces, I realized I wasn't trembling. I spoke about silence, the kind that kills, and about laughter used as a weapon. I told them how belief can become the first medicine. When I finished, the room was quiet, then softly clapping, respectful and real. Back home, I framed a photograph of my mother beside the lighthouse. Her eyes looked gentle but firm, just like I remembered. I whispered. I asked the second question, Mom, and felt something in the air ease. It wasn't closure, it was connection, finally understood. Sometimes at night, I dream of her sitting beside me with her teacup, saying, "See, you learned to heal yourself," and I wake smiling, not crying. Evan moved to another city for work, and though our paths rarely crossed, we exchanged letters once in a while. His handwriting grew steadier over time, his apologies softer, more sincere. He wrote once, "You taught me what truth costs. I hope one day I'll earn it too." I never replied, but I folded that letter neatly into my journal. Some things don't need words, they just need to rest quietly where they can't be lost. I still volunteer every Thursday. Some evenings I stay late, walking through the empty clinic halls. The hum of the refrigerators and the faint smell of disinfectant always remind me where I started. Sometimes I imagine Vale's voice fading into static, his laugh dissolving into wind. Not out of hatred, but because ghosts only have power if you keep listening. I stopped listening a long time ago. Now, when I look at my reflection, I don't see a victim or a survivor. I see a witness who chose to write her ending differently. I've learned that justice doesn't erase pain, but it gives it purpose. And maybe that's enough. So, to whoever's listening, if someone tells you your pain isn't real, don't shrink to fit their comfort. Keep your records, trust your instincts, ask the second question, and refuse to be erased. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you pause or look closer, then share it, like, comment, and subscribe to remind someone out there that truth always leaves a trail. Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to follow it.